In Gaza, just a few days ago, 15 emergency and aid workers from the Red Crescent, from Palestinian Civil Defense, and from the United Nations were found buried in a mass grave. They had been buried near destroyed ambulances and near clear marked vehicles. These individuals were killed, yes, assassinated, by Israeli occupying forces while attempting to save lives.
In February, the Security Council came together to condemn the tragic death of a World Food Program worker in Houthi captivity and demanded the immediate release of all those unjustly detained by the Houthis. The United States once again demands the Houthis, who the United States has designated a foreign terrorist organization, release the dozens of staff members from the UN, international NGOs, and diplomatic missions they have detained.
26 years ago, in 1999, briefing the Security Council, former ICRC President Cornelius Sommaruga spoke of 20 active conflicts. Today, more than 120 conflicts are recorded by ICRC. Worldwide, and particularly in certain parts of the African continent, the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and Latin America, the nature of our conflicts has undergone profound changes, creating a new conflict landscape.
The lion's share of those losses has been incurred as a result of the Israeli military campaign in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which has been conducted with egregious violations of international humanitarian law. We discussed this matter in detail on 28 March during a closed Security Council meeting. Unfortunately, new reports continue to emerge from the region about ongoing humanitarian worker casualties, including United Nations representatives. On the 18th of March, an Al-Awda Health Association staff member was killed, and that day, a representative of Doctors Without Borders also died, the 10th worker from MSF who fell victim to the conflict in Gaza, following a strike on the UN complex in Deir al-Balah. On the 19th of March, a UNOPS staff member was killed, and 6 of his colleagues, 3 of whom work for UNMAS, were grievously wounded over the past days. In the recent days in March, 5 UNRWA staff members were killed, including a teacher, a doctor, and a nurse. Unfortunately, as we have heard once again from Madam Msuya today, the most horrific fears about the Palestinian Red Crescent staff have come to pass. These were individuals were in the area of the IDF military operation where it was carried out. They were trying to evacuate wounded Palestinians, and they themselves were subject to shelling. Up until recently, there was still a hope that these people were alive, but on the 31st of March, information surfaced about the discovery of 8 bodies.
377 humanitarians were killed in 20 countries. Moreover, since October 2023, more than 400 aid workers have been killed in Gaza alone.
And the humanitarian situation in conflict zones continues to deteriorate. In Gaza, the hard-won ceasefire has been breached, access to supplies and electricity cut off. UNRWA systematically suppressed, and humanitarian workers attacked in the course of their duties. In Lebanon, South Sudan, and the DRC, peacekeeping forces have been targeted, resulting in massive casualties among peacekeepers. In Sudan, humanitarian workers carried out their work in extremely dangerous conditions. In Yemen, dozens of UN personnel are still being detained. These harsh realities require the international community to enhance its sense of urgency, to speak with a more unified voice, and to take stronger actions to protect humanitarian and UN personnel.
And I pay tribute to those on the front line and extend again my condolences to the families and friends of those who have lost their lives. In the first 3 months of 2025, the Aid Worker Security Database has already recorded 64 deaths, 36 injuries, and 8 kidnappings. The majority were local or national aid workers. The most dangerous place to deliver humanitarian assistance is Gaza, with over 400 aid workers reportedly killed since the beginning of the conflict. And that is followed by Sudan and South Sudan. We're also concerned about the aid workers detained by the Houthis in Yemen and call for their release. And we stress the need for the safety of aid workers in Myanmar.
From Haiti to DRC, Yemen, Mali, and Ukraine, violence, disinformation, and intimidation have led to the killing and injury of hundreds of UN and humanitarian workers. This is evident in Gaza, which, for 23 days now, has been under a complete blockade, with 2 million people cut off from aid, water, food, and electricity. As we've heard today, since Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th and the ensuing conflict, more than 400 humanitarian staff, including 288 UN staff, have been killed in Gaza. And as a result, the UN is now faced to scale back its presence, putting its stay and deliver strategy in jeopardy. Just last week, the Council addressed this in a private meeting on the attack on a deconflicted UN compound in Deir al-Balah, an attack which killed 1 UN staff member and severely injured 5 others. This weekend, we've learned of the further devastating killings of over a dozen first responders, including Palestinian Red Crescent Society medical workers, while being dispatched to aid wounded civilians in Rafah. After 5 days of negotiations, UN teams were finally permitted to access the area, only to find their remains, ambulances, fire truck, and a UN vehicle crushed and partially buried. These medical workers and humanitarians should have been protected in their work. Denmark calls on Israel to abide by international law and respect the rulings of the International Court of Justice. Israel is obliged to resume the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza and to ensure the basic needs of the civilian populations are met.
First, our collective commitment to peace and security must be guided by a renewed respect for and implementation of international law, not by a group of countries, not by a majority of the countries, but by all of us 15, and by all of us 193. Slovenia joined the global initiative on international humanitarian law launched by ICRC to reverse the erosion of respect for the international humanitarian law. As we have done time and again, we underline the respect for the protected status of humanitarian workers, facilities, and operations under international law. Intentionally directing attacks against personnel involved in a humanitarian assistance mission is a war crime and must be prosecuted accordingly.
Bonjour, la 9.
Good morning. The 9,889th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. I should like to take this opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of the Security Council to Her Excellency Madam Christina Marcus Lassen, Permanent Representative of Denmark, for her service as President of the Council during the month of March. I am sure that I speak for all members of the Security Council in expressing deep appreciation to Ambassador Marcus Lassen and her team for the great diplomatic acumen with which they conducted the Council's business last month. The provisional agenda for this meeting is protection of civilians in armed conflict. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Switzerland to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Madam Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Gilles Michaud, Undersecretary General for Safety and Security, and Mr. Nick Lee, Executive Director of the International NGO Safety Organization. It is so decided. The Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda.
Je donne à présent
I now give the floor to Madam Joyce Msuya.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, allow me to go straight to the point. Attacks on aid workers must end. Perpetrators must be held to account. Humanitarian workers are being killed in unprecedented numbers. According to available data, 2024 was the worst year on record, with 377 aid workers killed across 20 countries. This was almost 100 more fatalities than in 2023, which already saw a 137% increase from 2022. Many more were injured, kidnapped, attacked, and arbitrarily detained. The last 2 years have been particularly brutal. In Sudan, at least 85 humanitarian workers, all Sudanese nationals, have been killed since the current conflict began in April 2023. And just 3 days ago, on 30 March in Rafah, teams from OCHA and the Palestinian Red Crescent Society recovered from a mass grave the bodies of 15 emergency and aid workers from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, Civil Defense, and the United Nations, killed several days earlier by Israeli forces while trying to save lives. Their clearly marked vehicles were found destroyed and crushed. The OCHA team also witnessed civilians being shot while fleeing. This tragedy comes just 11 days after another deadly incident on 19th March, when yet another United Nations colleague was killed and 6 others were injured in Gaza. These deaths bring the number of aid workers killed in the Strip since 7 October 2023 to more than 408. Gaza is the most dangerous place for humanitarians ever. We extend our condolences to the families of the victims. We demand answers and call for justice. And since we are here today to discuss the protection of aid workers, I must ask this Council, what are you going to do to help us find those answers and achieve justice and avoid more killings? Mr. President, let us be clear. There is no shortage of robust international legal frameworks to protect humanitarian and UN workers. Human rights law and standards, conventions relating to the UN's activities and personnel, and international humanitarian law together provide clear obligations to safeguard humanitarian personnel, assets, and operations. What is lacking is the political will to comply. The vast majority of those killed, about 95%, are local aid workers, the cornerstone of relief efforts. Any humanitarian response would collapse without them. Since coming into this role, I have met local colleagues whose worlds have been destroyed, whose families have been displaced multiple times, who lost loved ones, who are unable to feed their children properly, who have survived harrowing security incidents, but who nonetheless bravely go to work every day to assist their communities and in some cases implement the mandate you, member states, gave them. These colleagues deserve our highest respect, yet conduct harming our local staff rarely elicit reactions or make the news. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, found that the killing of a local aid worker receives 500 times less media coverage than that of an international staff member. We have become numb to this violence. Being shot at is not, I repeat, not part of our job. Mr. President, as if death, injury, and kidnapping were not enough, humanitarians also face the criminalization of their work. More and more are detained, interrogated, and accused of supporting terrorism simply for delivering aid to people in need. There is more. Disinformation and misinformation campaigns targeting aid organizations have surged, such as in Haiti, the occupied Palestinian territory, or Yemen. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, disinformation campaigns have undermined the UN's credibility, fueled public unrest, and strained its relationship with local communities. In Sudan, since April 2023, false claims of partiality have led to aid workers being attacked at checkpoints or prevented from carrying out their work. Recent reports show aid workers and volunteers being targeted in Khartoum and beyond. In Haiti, armed gangs have publicly threatened humanitarian workers, and many organizations are unable to reach their offices or are forced to suspend operations. Funding shortfalls risk making matters worse, forcing us to make impossible choices between our mandate to serve the most affected people and the safety of our own teams. Mr. President, members of the Council, the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2730 was an important step in the right direction, and the Secretary General's recommendations show a way forward. I come to you and the broader UN membership with three asks. First, act to ensure respect for international law and to protect humanitarian and UN workers. From Security Council visits to fact-finding missions or withholding of arms transfers, to name only these, there are many tangible steps this Council and member states can take to protect humanitarian workers. We count on your leadership. Second, speak out. We need the voice of the Council and the broader UN membership to be loud, clear, and consistent in condemning harm to UN and humanitarian personnel, including local staff. Silence, inconsistency, and selective outrage only embolden perpetrators. We also need this Council and the broader UN membership to come in defense of UN and humanitarian organizations when these come under attack or are targeted by smear campaigns. Third, request accountability. Perpetrators of violations must face consequences of their actions without exception. Member states must strengthen domestic and international legal frameworks to investigate and prosecute international crimes. The Security Council should play a key role in pushing for accountability. For instance, by asking concerned governments to pursue justice and by following up with them. When national jurisdictions fail, the Council can use international mechanisms, including by referring situations to the International Criminal Court. But accountability is not only about prosecution. it must also center on those who survive. I want to reiterate the Secretary General's recommendation to adopt a survivor-centered approach, ensuring that those affected have a voice in global discussions. Survivors and their families urgently need legal aid, reparations, and access to services such as mental health support and trauma counseling. Mr. President, today, as we mourn the loss of our colleagues, we must demand that concrete action be taken to ensure our teams can work safely. We owe it to the families of the victims and survivors, to the communities we serve, and to all humanitarian colleagues risking their lives every day. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank Madame Souya for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Gilles Michaud. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to thank you once again for this opportunity which you have accorded to me to take stock of the security risks which the humanitarian community has been facing. I am grateful for your commitment and for the interest that the Security Council has focused on this matter, which embodies the principle of international solidarity, which is enshrined at the heart of the Charter of the United Nations. Today, more than ever before, your words and your action will determine both human lives and fates, and the hope which unites all of us that a care for human dignity and the need for decency will prevail over brute force and senseless violence. Let us see to it that international law, which was built upon the embers of historic tragedies, will prevail over the law of the strongest.
Excellencies, in my first briefing, I urged the Council to translate words of support for the protection of humanitarian and United Nations personnel into meaningful action, using the mechanism that member states have at their disposal. I asked all member states to join the Convention on Safety of United Nations and Associated Personnel and its optional protocol. I also called for genuine, courageous action to ensure accountability for attacks against humanitarian and UN personnel. Since that briefing, I regret to inform you that progress has been elusive. No additional member states has taken meaningful steps to join the convention. Attacks on humanitarian workers have continued unabated. Since the ceasefire collapse in Gaza, 11 United Nations personnel have been killed, bringing the total number of UN staff killed during this conflict to 288. The breakdown of the ceasefire has been particularly brutal. On March 19th, a clearly identified UN building came under direct attack. One colleague was killed and 6 others seriously injured. On March 23rd, an UNRWA colleague, along with 8 Palestinian Red Crescent and 6 civil defense staff, were killed while providing life-saving assistance. Their bodies left for days before they could be retrieved. In many other contexts, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Sudan, and in Yemen, humanitarian and United Nations personnel are regularly attacked, assaulted, and harassed. As always, our national colleagues bear the brunt of the violence. These attacks are designed to prevent the UN from helping the most vulnerable and to prevent them from bearing witness. Impunity for attacks on humanitarian personnel has become the new normal, a pervasive normal, an accepted normal. one perpetuated not only by non-state actors, but also by governments and their proxies. Let's be clear. Those who target humanitarian and United Nations personnel may have many motives, but above all, they do it because they can get away with it. This must end. Excellencies, against a backdrop of widespread disregard for international humanitarian law, UN agencies are now forced to significantly reduce assistance due to budget cuts imposed by several member states. Our humanitarian agencies are amongst the most affected. We should expect cuts in humanitarian assistance to drive further insecurity. I hope to be proven wrong. But there is only so much deprivation, despair, and sense of abandonment that communities can endure before violence erupts. And if, where and when the United Nations and its partners are forced to deliver less aid, the risk to UN and humanitarian personnel will grow. We are already seeing signs of this in Gaza and elsewhere. Humanitarian personnel may become the first target of people's despair. In such contexts, the UN must and will adapt. Budgetary pressures on the UN will impact the level of security support available. We will need to adjust our footprint, and in some areas we may even be compelled by resource constraints to completely withdraw. But the UN security will do its part through these turbulent times. We will be present wherever our humanitarian partners need us. It is what you expect. It is what we, the peoples of the United Nations, demand. And we will continue to engage with this Council and with member states. First, to seek common solutions and build support for a UN security system that enables delivery of the mandates you have given us. Secondly, to protect the humanitarian, peace and security, as well as development investments many of you have made through the United Nations. This will be particularly important in places where this Council chooses to adjust the United Nations presence through the deployment, reconfiguration, or withdrawal of peace operations. Adequate and timely security capabilities and capacities, both during and after the presence of peace operations, is critical. In these contexts and beyond, and through these perilous times, you have my unwavering commitment that UN security will remain a steadfast, reliable partner to the humanitarian and development community and member states. But we need attacks on United Nations and humanitarian personnel to stop. Excellencies, in recent years, we have been so busy breaking things that we have almost forgotten that we can fix them as well. It is a choice we can make, individually and collectively. In his letter to this Council dated November 22nd, 2024, the Secretary General outlined concrete recommendations to protect UN and humanitarian personnel from such attacks, and in doing so, to preserve our shared dignity in the face of dehumanizing violence. These recommendations represent a pathway to a better, stronger, and safe international humanitarian system. Excellencies, in closing, a member state recently asked me whether we should be concerned that this climate of impunity will discourage people from pursuing humanitarian work. Allow me to be blunt. This is the least of my concerns. I am very confident that there are and always will be many people with the passion and courage to help the most vulnerable, even in the most dangerous places. They represent the best of our shared humanity. They embody the Charter. Their courage should inspire us. My real concern is this: will we, the UN security system, the international community, and this Council find the same courage and conviction to protect them? To speak the truth when international humanitarian law is violated, regardless of who the perpetrators are. To show the will to hold all perpetrators accountable for their actions. I urge each and every Council member to lead the way. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank Mr. Michaud for his briefing. And I now give the floor to Mr. Nick Lee.
Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you very much for the opportunity to address the Council and for your attention to this topic. Just by way of a brief introduction, the International NGO Safety Organization, or INSO, is an independent non-profit that serves as the safety and security coordinating body for the NGO community. We're supporting over 1,400 local and international NGOs in 22 of the highest risk contexts, and we work very closely with Gilles and Joyce through the UN Security Management System, and particularly the Saving Lives Together initiative. I have three objectives really here today. The first is to update you on the current trends affecting humanitarian safety, which Joyce eloquently covered also. Second, to brief you on some of the progress that has been made. And finally, to make our recommendations as what could be done next. Mr. President, seen through the eyes of a humanitarian, the world is a volatile and dangerous place. On a daily basis, we navigate national and international armed conflicts that are conducted without respect for international humanitarian law, and generally with a blatant disregard for the lives of the civilians caught up in them. The proliferation of armed actors can leave us negotiating access on a village-by-village basis, while states and governments increasingly view aid as a partisan act to be directed, controlled, or criminalized. On average, at least one aid worker is killed, injured, or abducted every single day. Among other causes, in 2024, they have lost their lives to airstrikes in Palestine, IEDs in Somalia, ambushes in DR Congo, and intercommunal violence in South Sudan. As others have said, these deaths are rarely investigated and their perpetrators are never held accountable. National and locally recruited personnel are particularly vulnerable, accounting for over 90% of victims in all contexts, and yet the international recognition and response to their death is often lacking. At 30% of incidents, and for the second year in a row, government forces posed more of a threat to humanitarians than non-state armed groups, with the leading cause of death being explosive weapons in urban environments, most notably in Gaza, Ukraine, and Sudan. Violence at the hands of non-state armed groups remained prevalent at 20%, but has diminished significantly with the winding up of conflict in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, with the most common incidents now occurring across West, Central, and Eastern Africa. Crime is endemic in conflict zones and remains a key driver of insecurity, accounting to 40% of all incidents in 2024, while the criminalization of aid itself has emerged as a major challenge, with over 400 aid workers arrested throughout the year for delivering assistance and an explosive growth in NGO bans and restrictions. These are frequently combined with disinformation campaigns against the fundamental legitimacy of aid, and have led in some cases to the suspension of life-saving medical assistance, the removal of senior humanitarian leaders, and the closure of common services. Mr. President, Excellencies, while the situation is undoubtedly challenging, we cannot overlook the many positive initiatives that have emerged at all levels. At the operational level, the highest risk countries are now covered by a network of field safety platforms providing round-the-clock support that is equally accessible to national and international NGOs. The community has access to an unprecedented volume and quality of data and a wide range of training opportunities in everything from first aid to access negotiations. The various international councils and forums have helped cooperation between NGOs become routine, while cooperation between the NGOs and the UN, particularly under the Saving Lives Together initiative, is improving. And I'd like to thank USG Michaud for his commitment to that initiative. More recently, new projects have emerged offering financial, legal, and psychosocial support to victims of violence and filling an important gap in accountability and duty of care. At the policy level, humanitarian safety has taken centre stage also, from the EU call to action in 2021, the ministerial group action to protect aid workers convened by the Australian Foreign Minister last year, and now the welcome introduction of 2730. Taken together, these developments represent a robust and comprehensive response and highlight the importance of operational agencies taking the lead in devising solutions to their own problems. While recognizing that many of the risks facing humanitarians fall outside of the power of the Council to address, there remain several areas where it can take meaningful action. First, Mr. President, the Council could encourage donor states to also stay and deliver, especially during times of crisis and transition. The voluntary withdrawal of in-country representation, as occurred wholesale in Afghanistan in 2022, leaves NGOs vulnerable and makes it harder to develop the common operating picture that is so vital. Other options could include the deployment of special humanitarian envoys or the encouragement of multi-state initiatives to facilitate continued diplomatic engagement on humanitarian issues, even during times of acute crisis. Second, we believe more can and should be done to protect humanitarian space and challenge the worrying trend on the criminalization of aid. At the core of this issue is the principle of impartial contact with all parties to a conflict, and the Council must ensure that organizations can accomplish this without fear of harassment, sanction, or punishment. This includes supporting the important mandate of UNOCHA to open and maintain humanitarian space and ensuring a strong collective response when they are victimized for doing so. It also includes ensuring that the carve-outs of Resolution 2664 are replicated in both domestic and international legislation to further protect independent, impartial, and neutral humanitarian action. Third and finally, we suggest that the protection of aid workers is always approached through the more inclusive lens of the protection of civilians. While we welcome the attention, the fact is that violence against aid workers is more commonly linked to their identity as civilians than as aid workers. And by isolating us, there is a risk that wider impacts are neglected. Where we see gross violations of international humanitarian law, the Council must act decisively and address the double standard of member states who continue to support those responsible for civilian and aid worker deaths alike. Thank you again for your time and consideration.
I would like to thank Mr. Lee for his briefing. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Algeria. Thank you, President.
At the outset, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Denmark for the successful presidency over the past month. We also extend our congratulations to France for assuming the presidency of the Council this month and assure them of Algeria's full support and cooperation. And we are grateful to ASG Joyce Msuya and USG Gilles Michaud for their insightful briefings. We have also listened carefully to the civil society briefers. Mr. President, this is a timely meeting to discuss the implementation of Resolution 2730, which calls for the respect for the protection of humanitarian and the United Nations personnel. In Gaza, just a few days ago, 15 emergency and aid workers from the Red Crescent, from Palestinian Civil Defense, and from the United Nations were found buried in a mass grave. They had been buried near destroyed ambulances and near clear marked vehicles. These individuals were killed, yes, assassinated, by Israeli occupying forces while attempting to save lives. They deserve justice. As ASG Msuya stated, we should speak out. We need the voice of the Security Council and the broader UN membership to be loud and clear. Almost a year after the adoption of Resolution 2730, it is unfortunate to note that despite its ambitions, this resolution, this decision of the Security Council has had very little impact on the ground. 2024 was the deadliest year on record for humanitarian personnel, with 377 aid workers killed, nearly 100 more fatalities than in 2023, and more than 3 times than in 2022. Of these humanitarian personnel killed in 2024, 207 were in the occupied Palestinian territory. And this tragic reality compels us to question the relevance of Resolution 2730, the relevance of international humanitarian law, and even the relevance of the Security Council itself. To address this situation, I would like to emphasize the following points. First, the necessity of independent investigation and accountability. Throughout investigation and accountability, thorough investigation and accountability are fundamental elements of Resolution 2730. But since October 7, 2023, over 400 aid workers have been killed in Gaza, including 8 foreigners. And we demand justice for all of them. It is unacceptable that the killing of UNOPS staffer is investigated by the United Nations, while hundreds of innocent Palestinian lives are not afforded the same attention, the same justice. Second, guaranteeing effective protection. Resolution 2730 affirms that attacks directed at humanitarian personnel, the United Nations, and their premises and assets are considered war crimes under international law. However, these principles, these basic principles, does not seem to apply to the Israeli occupying power. All peoples, all infrastructure appears to be deemed legitimate targets, whether it's UN facilities, such as UNRWA buildings, or UNOPS accommodations, or humanitarian deconflicted facilities like those of the ICRC and Médecins Sans Frontières. No one and nowhere is safe in Gaza. This behavior of the Israeli occupying power cannot continue. Humanitarian personnel and their assets must receive the effective protection to which they are entitled. Third, Mr. President, ensuring respect for international humanitarian law. Resolution 2730, and I quote, calls upon all states and parties to armed conflict to respect and ensure respect for applicable international humanitarian law in all circumstances. From the very beginning of the negotiation process of this resolution, Algeria was clear: without a robust mechanism to ensure respect for international humanitarian law and end impunity, all efforts will be in vain. Continued violation of international humanitarian law, as we witness in Gaza today, represent our collective failure. The international community is not fulfilling its obligations. In fact, the behavior of parties to conflicts is no longer shaped by Security Council resolution, is no longer shaped by international humanitarian law. Instead, it is driven by impunity from which the Israeli occupying power has benefited. What we are witnessing today in Gaza set a dangerous precedent for current and future conflicts, where no rules are respected. Mr. President, adopted amid the ongoing Israeli aggression against Gaza, Resolution 2730 was an urgent and timely reminder of our obligations to respect, to protect humanitarian personnel. However, it has had no real impact on the ground, and humanitarian workers continue to be targeted with impunity. It is time to end this cycle of impunity through effective accountability mechanisms. It is time to move beyond the selective application of resolution, double standard. It is time to honor our collective commitment to the dignity, yes, the dignity and worth of every human being. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Algeria, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, at the outset, allow me to congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Council for this month, and I wish you all success. Also, I take this opportunity to commend the able manner that the Danish presidency guided the work of the Council last month. I extend my deepest gratitude to ASG Msuya and USG Muchad for their sobering briefing on the grave situation facing civilian and humanitarian workers worldwide. We have listened carefully to the remarks made by Mr. Lee. Mr. President, let me begin by paying tribute to the brave humanitarian workers who have made the ultimate sacrifice while serving humanity. Their unwavering dedication in the face of danger represents the very best of our shared human spirit. Their courage inspires us all, and their loss diminishes us profoundly. Mr. President, as we have heard from the briefers, the global landscape for humanitarian workers has become increasingly lethal. Since last year, over 500 aid workers have been killed, injured, detained, or kidnapped worldwide, painting a devastating picture of the risks these dedicated individuals face daily. The situation in Gaza, the deadliest place for humanitarian workers, stands as a stark testament to this development. With 408 humanitarian personnel, including 280 UN staff members, have paid the ultimate price. The recent discovery of 15 emergency workers in a mass grave near Rafah, wearing their protective gear, represents one of the most devastating attacks on humanitarian personnel in recent history. These dedicated individuals were killed while attempting to save lives, a stark violation of every principle we hold sacred. This constitutes a war crime and demands immediate investigation and accountability. The pattern of violence against humanitarian workers extends across multiple conflict zones. In Sudan, over 108 workers have been killed since April 2023, while in the DRC, we have witnessed a sharp rise in targeted assaults, with 42 aid workers killed while serving in some of the most challenging environments. These deliberate attacks on medical facilities and aid convoys have severely compromised the ability to reach millions in desperate need. In light of these unprecedented challenges, we propose the following 4 points. First, we must reinforce and commit to the unwavering adherence of international humanitarian law. Second, the enhancement of humanitarian funding is essential, with a specific focus on personnel security, mental health, and support for aid workers. Third, we must integrate robust measures to counter misinformation and hate speech targeting humanitarian mission within UN operations. Fourth and last, we must exert more effort in regular high diplomatic engagements with conflict parties to achieve permanent ceasefires toward sustainable peace in active conflict zones. Mr. President, the implementation of Resolution 2730 must be strengthened through enhanced protection mechanism guaranteed humanitarian access, and reinforced accountability for violations at the national and international level. As we mark the 76th anniversary of the Geneva Convention, we must remember that protecting aid workers is not merely a legal obligation, it's a moral imperative essential for preserving humanity in times of conflict. Every day without action means more aid workers lost, more critical operations suspended, and more vulnerable population left without essential assistance. Mr. President, as I conclude, I emphasize that it's critical for all of us to act with unprecedented resolve. We must honor the sacrifices of the fallen humanitarian workers through concrete actions and to protect those who continue their vital work on the ground by ensuring commitment to principles of international law and justice for those who have perished while serving humanity. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Somalia. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President, and welcome.
Undersecretary General Michaud, Assistant Secretary General Misuya, and Executive Director Lee for your informative briefings. Let me also take this opportunity to thank Denmark for its well-handled presidency last month. Colleagues, the United States remains committed to protecting UN and humanitarian personnel and civilians around the world. Humanitarian workers put themselves at risk to support people in dire need, often in active conflict zones. It's a violation of international humanitarian law to target those civilians who assist and protect the most vulnerable. In February, the Security Council came together to condemn the tragic death of a World Food Program worker in Houthi captivity and demanded the immediate release of all those unjustly detained by the Houthis. The United States once again demands the Houthis, who the United States has designated a foreign terrorist organization, release the dozens of staff members from the UN, international NGOs, and diplomatic missions they have detained. We condemn the Houthis' sham so-called judicial proceedings against detainees as potential pretext for politically motivated killings. The United States will continue to hold the Houthis to account and expects the Security Council to do the same. We remain similarly concerned for the security of humanitarian staff in Sudan. Early February saw a surge in civilian deaths with at least 275 killed in a 6-day span. We iterate the call for the parties to immediately cease hostilities, allow unhindered humanitarian access, and protect civilians. We call on all parties, both the RSF and SAF, to hold those committing acts of violence against humanitarian workers accountable and ensure the protection of civilians consistent with their obligations under international humanitarian law. We see the same threats to humanitarian workers in South Sudan, which remains one of the most dangerous places in the world for aid workers. Access constraints across the country, including targeted violence and bureaucratic impediments, hamper efforts to deliver urgent, life-saving assistance to the most vulnerable populations. The Russian-Ukraine war has had especially devastating effects on civilians and civilian infrastructure. President Trump has made clear this violence must end. Then there is the toll in Gaza. For far too long, Hamas has cynically misused civilian infrastructure to shield themselves. That misuse has caused civilians to be caught in the crossfire. Let us not forget the use of civilians to shield or impede military operations is itself a violation of international humanitarian law. We expect all parties to comply with international humanitarian law. It is important for the UN to speak out against repeated misuses of its facilities by Hamas, each of which has made the safety of humanitarian workers more precarious. The Geneva Conventions remain as critical now as ever. 2024 saw the highest death toll of humanitarian workers on record. That sobering record should compel the UN and this Council to redouble efforts to protect humanitarian personnel everywhere. And with that, je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I thank the representative of the United States. Next, I give the floor to the representative of Panama. Thank you, President. We'd like to congratulate the permanent representative of Denmark upon the successful steering of the Council during their presidency of the Council in March. And we would like to wish our very best wishes to France as they go about presiding over the Council in April. They can count on our constructive support as they go about their work this month. We'd like to thank the briefers for their presentations this morning, Ms. Joyce Msuya, ASG for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Gilles Michaud, USG for Safety and Security, and Mr. Nick Lee, Executive Director of the International NGO Safety Organization. We think this meeting is timely as it allows us once again to reaffirm our unwavering commitments to the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. This must always prevail. It is based on the respect for international humanitarian law and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Resolution 2730 from last year, which was adopted in this Council, was an important landmark. It set us on the right track, and it remains fully relevant because it urges all states and parties to armed conflicts to protect humanitarian personnel, United Nations personnel, and all associated personnel. Compliance with this is critical at all times. In armed conflicts, civilians, in particular women, have increasingly become victims of violence and insecurity. In sync with Resolution 2730, Panama reaffirms the importance of the full, equal, safe and meaningful participation of women in humanitarian activities and United Nations work. And we stress the importance of protecting and safeguarding their integrity and fundamental rights. In this context, we are alarmed to see the increase in the number of attacks on the ground against humanitarian personnel. In many cases, they work with local stakeholders, and their members are critical for the effective deployment and distribution of humanitarian aid. They are risking their lives to fulfill their humanitarian work, and they have the noble goal of helping and protecting civilians who are frequently innocent victims of armed conflicts, and this at all times and in all places. It is concerning to have heard all too frequently from many and too many places news such as that which was circulated on the 31st of March, which referred to finding more than 10 victims in Gaza under rubble and sand who have been identified as members of the Palestinian Red Cross, the Palestine Civil Defense, inter alia, and they included also a member of United Nations staff who had been reported as disappeared on the 23rd of March. Serious matters such as these always require exhaustive investigations to shed light on exactly what happened and also to identify the responsibilities. These are regrettable examples of incidents that should never happen, and they tragically underscore the need and obligation for parties to protect civilians and, above all, humanitarian staff in areas of armed conflict. President, we join the call made by the Secretary-General for the security of humanitarian staff to be guaranteed at all times, as well as the inviolability of their facilities by all parties at all times. This fundamental principle must go hand in hand with appropriate conditions on the ground to allow them to work safely and effectively. Attacks against them, against peacekeeping personnel and civilian infrastructure, are war crimes. That is why we urge all parties to conflicts, and conflicts which are increasingly impactful and increasingly numerous, to, at all case, investigate events when they occur, to promote accountability, and to ensure there is no space for impunity. We take this opportunity to pay tribute to the victims and to recognize the efforts that they make every day to protect the most vulnerable people. We urgently call on all parties to guarantee the security of these people, as is set down by the Geneva Conventions. To those working for peace, we reiterate our admiration and respect. Their dedication should inspire us all not to lose sight of what is critical, to protect civilians, to alleviate human suffering, and to open space for understanding, even in the midst of tragedy. President, Panama urges all parties to conflicts to redouble efforts to facilitate humanitarian access, the protection of all civilians, and to guarantee conditions on the ground that would allow humanitarian personnel to work safely and effectively, pursuant to international law and international humanitarian law. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Panama. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece. Thank you very much, President. I would like to begin by wishing the best of success to France during this month, and I assure them of our full cooperation. And I'd also like to thank Denmark for their successful steering of the presidency last month. I would also like to thank the briefers for their comprehensive and interesting presentations.
The protection of civilians in armed conflict remains a cornerstone of the Security Council agenda and a core obligation of the international community under international humanitarian law. An increasingly more contested, violent and dangerous world for civilians in armed conflict required collective actions to strengthen compliance with international humanitarian law and address implementation challenges. 26 years ago, in 1999, briefing the Security Council, former ICRC President Cornelius Sommaruga spoke of 20 active conflicts. Today, more than 120 conflicts are recorded by ICRC. Worldwide, and particularly in certain parts of the African continent, the Middle East, Europe, Asia, and Latin America, the nature of armed conflicts has undergone profound changes, creating a new conflict landscape. Contemporary armed conflicts have become more protracted and complex, marked by involvement of non-state actors, urban warfare, cyber threats, and the use of new technologies of warfare. Moreover, the growing use of digital technologies can amplify the spread of harmful information and incite to violence. These changes significantly exacerbate risks of civilians and pose challenge to humanitarian action as well as threats to humanitarian and UN personnel. Resolution 2730, drafted by Switzerland, adopted last year and co-sponsored by a large number of other member states, 90, including my own country, Greece, has already become an indispensable part of the UN normative framework pertaining to the protection of civilians. The resolution emphasizes the protection of humanitarian and UN and associated personnel, including national and locally recruited personnel, and the premises and assets. It also highlights misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, especially on digital platforms, as a growing challenge that undermines trust in UN and humanitarian organizations and exposes humanitarian and UN and associated personnel, including national and locally recruited personnel, to risk. This resolution underlies the centrality of accountability and protection of civilians' efforts and reaffirms the need to end impunity for serious violations of international humanitarian law and other international crimes, including those involving attacks against humanitarian personnel and UN and associated personnel. Mr. President, as UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reported last November, the death toll of humanitarian workers in 2024 has become the deadliest on record, with 377 killed globally. This is a grim reality on the ground. Resolution 2730 delivers a strong message, not just of moral imperative, but also of the need to have the operational agility to prevent and mitigate risks threatening humanitarian and UN personnel. Humanitarian personnel is a beacon of hope and a relief to people suffering in conflict zones. They fulfill the duty facing immense constraints, including attacks against their lives, bureaucratic impediments, and the impact of public perception of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech pertaining to humanitarian actors in their work. Despite all those dangers, humanitarian UN personnel persist, remain, and deliver life-saving support to millions of people in armed conflicts worldwide. It is our duty, therefore, as members of the Security Council, to ensure that they fulfill their duty in safety and dignity and with the credit they deserve. Mr. President, we need concerted efforts, including the Security Council, to safeguard compliance to international humanitarian law and human rights law, highlight current trends, adopt a more comprehensive approach to the protection of civilians, break the pattern of violations, and ensure accountability for the perpetrators of harm. Protection of civilians in armed conflict is a fundamental prerequisite for lasting peace and security. It is our hope that the upcoming Protection of Civilian Week and the UN Security Council open debate of protection of civilians next May will contribute to decisive actions being taken to safeguard the lives and the dignity of civilians caught in armed conflict. Mr. President, in concluding, let me stress that for 8 decades now, the UN constitutes a common ground to maintain peace and security. We have to live up to our commitments to protect civilians and to ensure that humanitarian and UN personnel carry out their work in a conducive, legal, administrative, and security framework. Je vous remercie.
I thank you. I thank the permanent representative of Greece for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Coordinator, Madam Joyce Messia, as well as the USG for Safety and Security, Mr. Jean Michaud, for the report on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2730, which addresses the protection of humanitarian workers and UN personnel. We have taken note of the statement delivered by the civil society representative, Mr. Nick Lee. There is no doubt that in the context of armed conflict, humanitarian assistance is a lifeline for thousands and hundreds of thousands of civilians, and in some instances we are talking about millions of innocent civilians whose survival directly hinges on the support provided by humanitarian structures. Moreover, humanitarian activity at the same time is fraught with colossal risks. Humanitarian and medical workers, rescuers, volunteers, UN representatives themselves frequently teeter on the brink between life and death, between the need to deliver assistance and threats to their own safety. Their labor is not merely employment, it is a feat. Today, we wish to pay tribute to those who, under the most perilous and unpredictable circumstances, risk their lives to save those of others. Their courage, sacrifice, and unstinting resilience deserve particular recognition. Mr. President, over the past 2 years, we have all fully seen clearly just how perilous the profession of humanitarian workers remains. 2024 was the deadliest year in the entire history of observation, having claimed the lives of at least 377 members of the humanitarian community. This year, 2025, may exceed that horrific record, and we must do everything possible to prevent that from occurring. The lion's share of those losses has been incurred as a result of the Israeli military campaign in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which has been conducted with egregious violations of international humanitarian law. We discussed this matter in detail on 28 March during a closed Security Council meeting. Unfortunately, new reports continue to emerge from the region about ongoing humanitarian worker casualties, including United Nations representatives. On the 18th of March, an Al-Awda Health Association staff member was killed, and that day, a representative of Doctors Without Borders also died, the 10th worker from MSF who fell victim to the conflict in Gaza, following a strike on the UN complex in Deir al-Balah. On the 19th of March, a UNOPS staff member was killed, and 6 of his colleagues, 3 of whom work for UNMAS, were grievously wounded. Over the past days, in the recent days in March, 5 UNRWA staff members were killed, including a teacher, a doctor, and a nurse. Unfortunately, as we have heard once again from Madam Msuya today, the most horrific fears about the Palestinian Red Crescent staff have come to pass. These individuals were in the area of the IDF military operation where it was carried out. They were trying to evacuate wounded Palestinians, and they themselves were subject to shelling. Up until recently, there was still a hope that these people were alive, but on the 31st of March, information surfaced about the discovery of 8 bodies. We wish to touch upon the situation of UNRWA on the Palestinian territory. Since September 2023, the number of dead UNRWA representatives exceeded 280 people since 7 October 2023. According to incoming reports this morning, the IDF carried out yet another strike targeting an UNRWA medical facility in Jabalia, which was being used as a refuge for 700 peaceful civilians. They're dead and they're wounded. Once again, we wish to recall the unacceptability of attacks on UN premises, which unfortunately is being carried out on a regular basis in Gaza. The situation with UNRWA starkly illustrates the fact that the protection of humanitarian personnel is not limited merely to preventing acts of physical violence, but this also incorporates a multitude of other forms of unacceptable pressure, including psychological pressure. An unprecedented disinformation campaign has been unleashed against the agency. This has triggered attacks, persecution, and intimidation of UNRWA staff. Under colossal pressure, these people are compelled to carry out operations, fearing for their lives as well as the lives of their families and loved ones. Once again, we extend our support to UNRWA. We believe that its activity and efforts are indispensable, especially amid the current catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip, which continues to be gripped by a complete humanitarian blockade. Mr. President, we increasingly hear from representatives of certain states and certain structures. We hear from them calls for new approaches to be crafted, approaches to ensure the safety of humanitarian personnel and to help to ensure accountability for the perpetrators of violations of international humanitarian law. However, in our view, existing international obligations are more than sufficient. The matter merely lies in scrupulous compliance therewith. We are talking first and foremost the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions on the Protection of the Victims of War dating 1949 and additional protocols thereunder. It is with disappointment that we observe that even among the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, there are states who have not acceded to these instruments. We believe that universal accession to these instruments and compliance with their provisions will help to ensure the protection of civilians, including humanitarian workers. There are also other instruments which exist, including the 1994 Convention on the Safety of UN and Associated Personnel. However, this convention also has not been universally acceded to either. What new instruments can we talk about if the Security Council or the General Assembly of the United Nations are unable to enforce previous ones which remain fully relevant with the passage of time? nor should we lose sight of a number of key specialized resolutions mentioned by UN bodies through which there is a frequent update and regular updating of approaches to ensuring the protection of humanitarian workers as well as UN staff. Last May, Resolution 2730 was adopted, which reaffirms the overriding need to comply with the norms of IHL, including those set out in the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols thereto. We consistently support this premise as well as a number of other provisions of Resolution 2730. However, when it was being adopted, we were compelled to abstain because the text of the document contained some language which is not fully accurate, and some of this language may result in distorted interpretation. I now turn to the recommendations drafted by the Secretary General on the protection of humanitarian personnel. Our approach to this was already presented by us in November of last year during the relevant Security Council meeting. Some of these recommendations deserve support, and others, frankly speaking, are contentious in our view. Moreover, in our view, the report of the Secretary General has certain shortcomings. For example, in listing principles for the delivery of humanitarian assistance contained in General Assembly Resolution 46/182, no mention is made of the principle of consent and coordination with the national government. And yet this is precisely one of the key factors for mitigating risks to the safety of humanitarian personnel. We believe that humanitarian structures need to exercise maximum responsibility when it comes to protection of their staff, and they need to develop close cooperation with official authorities of the country of the host state to mitigate risks and to develop the most efficient formats for the delivery of assistance to those in need. Mr. President, to conclude, I wish to note that no one among us has any doubt about the need to do our utmost to prevent attacks and acts of violence against civilians, including humanitarian workers, during armed conflict. At the same time, we must also bear in mind that the soundest way to achieve this goal is to ensure a ceasefire and to prioritize the quest for political diplomatic solutions and in conflict. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to extend our warm congratulations to you and France on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month, and be assured of our fullest support. I also take this opportunity to commend Denmark for its successful and effective presidency of the Council in March. I thank Assistant Secretary General Joyce Musuya and Under Secretary General Jill Michaud for their comprehensive, sobering, as well as their call to action, comprehensive and sobering briefings, as well as their call to action. I also thank Mr. Nick Lee for his contributions to these discussions. We agree with the briefers. Attack on UN and humanitarian personnel must end. As said by Assistant Secretary General Musuya, being shot at is not part of their job. Sierra Leone approaches this important issue with a strong conviction and lived experience. We recall with humility and resolve our history when in the general context, civilians in Sierra Leone suffer grave atrocities during the civil conflict. It was through a combination of national will, unwavering humanitarian work, international solidarity, and robust peacekeeping with a focus on justice and reconciliation that we emerge from that dark chapter. We therefore remain steadfast in our commitment to ensuring that no community endures such suffering again, as we urge for the full protection of UN and humanitarian personnel. Mr. President, almost 26 years since the Security Council first considered the protection of civilians as a formal agenda item, millions of civilians continue to bear the brunt of armed conflict, with indiscriminate violence, displacement, and humanitarian suffering persistent across conflict theaters. This is despite the robust legal frameworks of international humanitarian law, as well as international human rights law, and repeated calls by this Council to be vigilant, to disregard Despite the robust legal frameworks of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and a repeated call by this Council, belligerents continue to disregard their obligations to protect civilians, and in this case, humanitarian workers. For instance, the 2024 report of the Secretary General is a stark reminder of the prevailing challenges. Civilian harm from the use of explosive weapons in protected areas remain devastating, with over 67,000 casualties recorded in 2024 alone, a majority of whom were killed or injured in urban settings. These figures are not just statistics. They are individual lives, families torn apart, and communities destabilized. In this regard, Sierra Leone reiterates its support for the Secretary General's call on states to endorse and implement the 2022 Political Declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians, as well as the protection of humanitarian workers. We continue to reaffirm the principles and provisions of Security Council Resolution 2730. Mr. President, the protection of humanitarian personnel is part of a broader, bleak picture. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned by the continued breaches of POC obligations by parties to conflict across various situations before the Security Council. In Gaza, we continue to witness alarming reports of indiscriminate bombardment, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and attack on humanitarian personnel, which contravene the basic tenets of IHL. In Sudan, the conflict has generated one of the worst displacement crises globally, with systemic targeting of civilians and humanitarian workers, sexual violence, and obstruction of humanitarian access. In Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, civilians are caught in the crossfire of armed groups' activity, often driven by competition over natural resources, and frequently subject to forced recruitment and gender-based violence. In Haiti, violence from armed gangs have engulfed urban centers, displaced thousands, and leaving civilians at the mercy of lawlessness. The security and humanitarian toll in Ukraine and Syria continue to be marked by extensive civilian suffering amid ongoing hostilities. These examples point to an urgent need for greater accountability and compliance by all parties, and a reinvigoration of this Council's protection mandate. Mr. President, by reason of the foregoing, allow me to highlight 3 points to reinforce the protection of civilian agenda. First, the protection of civilians must be anchored in respect for international law, particularly IHL and international human rights law. Both state and non-state actors must be reminded that the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian objects, humanitarian personnel and humanitarian property, or the failure to take precaution constitute a violation of international law and may amount to war crimes. Compliance must be matched with accountability, ensuring that violators are brought to justice through national or international mechanisms. Second, we welcome and support initiatives that galvanize political commitment to uphold IHL. In this regard, Sierra Leone welcomes the global initiative to galvanize political commitment to IHL, launched in September 2024 by Brazil, China, France, Jordan, and Kazakhstan, South Africa, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Sierra Leone is pleased to serve as a co-chair of the workstream on protecting civilian infrastructure, and we remain committed to contributing actively to its implementation. Third, the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance is a fundamental component of civilian protection. Humanitarian personnel must be protected from attacks, threats, and obstruction. The disturbing increase in targeted attacks on aid workers, including in Gaza, Sudan, and Haiti, undermines not only assistance delivery, but the very values that underpin the UN Charter. Parties to conflict must take concrete steps to enable safe humanitarian access and uphold principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. In closing, Mr. President, Sierra Leone urges all parties to conflict to distinguish at all times between civilians and combatants, to refrain from direct attacks on civilians or civilian objects, and to take all feasible precautions to avoid or, in the event, minimize incidental loss of civilian life and damage. Particular attention must be paid to the protection of vulnerable populations, women, children, the elderly, persons with disabilities, who often face compounded risk in conflict situations. Finally, we pay tribute to all humanitarian workers who represent the very best of humanity, and we honor those who've made the ultimate sacrifice. And I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I congratulate you on France's assumption of the presidency and commend Denmark for a successful presidency in the month of March. I thank ASG Masuya and USG Misha for the briefings and reiterate Guyana's gratitude to you and your teams for your dedication and for the work you continue to do to alleviate human suffering worldwide. We have also listened carefully to the statement by Mr. Nickley, Executive Director of the International NGO Safety Organization. Mr. President, the adoption of Resolution 2730 last May was a firm acknowledgement by the Security Council of the indispensable role of humanitarian personnel. Its adoption represented our collective commitment to their safety and security as they risk their lives each day to provide humanitarian aid and support to those in need. The resolution also reiterated the need to ensure respect for international humanitarian law, including commitments universally made in the 1949 Geneva Conventions and additional protocols thereto. Guyana remains deeply concerned about the increased attacks against humanitarian workers and UN personnel, including national and locally recruited staff and their premises and assets. Even as they dedicate their lives to alleviate human suffering, we are increasingly seeing humanitarians facing greater risks, becoming targets of attacks, suffering bodily harm, and even death. 2024 was reported as the deadliest year on record for humanitarian aid workers. As we heard from ASG Masuya, 377 humanitarians were killed in 20 countries. Moreover, since October 2023, more than 400 aid workers have been killed in Gaza alone. This horrific figure represents the highest number of aid workers who have died in a single conflict. We are deeply concerned that Gaza is now the epicenter for the deaths of humanitarian workers. We demand that the parties to the conflict uphold their legal obligations to protect UN and humanitarian aid workers and grant them unimpeded access to those in need. Guyana pays tribute to those humanitarian personnel who lost their lives in service and express condolences to their families and colleagues. Mr. President, addressing this issue requires a multifaceted, coordinated, and robust international response. Allow me to make a few points in this regard. First, accountability is a key pillar to the protection of civilians and central to the provisions of Resolution 2730. The killing of and attacks on humanitarian personnel are violations of international humanitarian law and require robust response from the Security Council. It is imperative that the perpetrators of these attacks be held to account. Ensuring the independent and impartial investigation and the prosecution of these crimes are necessary steps to deter future violations. In this regard, Guyana supports the Secretary General's recommendation for the Council to systematically request the concerned state authorities to conduct prompt, independent, impartial, and effective investigations into incidents and to report to the Council about progress and outcomes of these investigations, including on measures to prevent the reoccurrence of such harm, as well as for the Council to consider referrals to the International Criminal Court or other international tribunals where state authorities prove unable or unwilling to act. Guyana also supports efforts to strengthen objective accountability mechanisms at all levels, which can provide a pathway for justice and reinforce the rule of law. Secondly, Resolution 2730 underscores the critical importance of unhindered access of humanitarian personnel in the execution of their mandates without intimidation, interference, or violence. The deliberate obstruction of the delivery of humanitarian aid to conflict zones, coupled with bureaucratic barriers, is not only a violation of international humanitarian law, but also hinders the important work of humanitarian personnel and exacerbates the suffering of civilian populations. Guyana reiterates its call to all parties to conflicts to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and ensure the safe, timely, and unhindered access to humanitarian aid. Mr. President, pursuant to Resolution 2730, the Secretary General has put forward several recommendations on measures to prevent and respond to attacks against humanitarian and UN personnel and their premises and assets, adding to the roadmap to ensure that those on the front lines of humanitarian crises are protected from harm. Guyana urges all Council members to engage in constructive dialogue on these recommendations and to ensure the full implementation of Resolution 2730. We must take urgent and decisive action if we are to stem the current devastating trajectory and guarantee the safety and protection of UN and humanitarian personnel. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Guyana for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I would like to begin by congratulating France on its assumption of the presidency of the Council for this month, and congratulate Denmark on its successful completion of its presidency last month. I thank ASG Musuya and USG Michaud for their briefings. I've also listened carefully to the statement of the representative of civil society, Mr. Nick Lee. China supports the Council's discussion on the protection of humanitarian and UN personnel. I would like to take this opportunity to pay high tribute to humanitarian and UN personnel on the front lines of conflicts and to express our deep condolences to those who have lost their lives. President, in 2024, 377 humanitarian workers lost their lives in conflicts, which was unprecedented. The Council adopted Resolution 2730, which sets out clear requirements for the protection of humanitarian and UN personnel, and the Secretariat has made arduous efforts in this regard. However, we are saddened to see that attacks against humanitarian and UN personnel are still frequent occurrence. The basic principles of IHL are still being violated, and the humanitarian situation in conflict zones continues to deteriorate. In Gaza, the Hard Won ceasefire has been breached, access to supplies and electricity cut off. UNRWA systematically suppressed, and humanitarian workers attacked in the course of their duties. In Lebanon, South Sudan, and the DRC, peacekeeping forces have been targeted, resulting in massive casualties among peacekeepers. In Sudan, humanitarian workers carried out their work in extremely dangerous conditions. In Yemen, dozens of UN personnel are still being detained. These harsh realities require the international community to enhance its sense of urgency, to speak with a more unified voice, and to take stronger actions to protect humanitarian and UN personnel. We urge greater efforts to promote a ceasefire to end the fightings. Ending armed conflicts provides the most fundamental protection for humanitarian workers. The Security Council should discharge its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security and take necessary actions to effectively implement a ceasefire to end the fightings. To this end, parties to the conflict should implement relevant Council resolutions, renounce the option of force, and resolve their differences through dialogue and consultation. Countries with influence to bear should play a positive and constructive role. We call for a greater resolve to revitalize the authority of IHL. It is a fundamental principle of IHL that humanitarian and UN personnel must not be the target of military operations. In conflict situations, all parties must guarantee safe and unhindered humanitarian access and the safety of humanitarian agencies and their staff. On occupied land, the occupying power is obligated to protect the humanitarian needs of the civilians by facilitating humanitarian operations. The mandate of the UN missions should be respected and freedom of movement guaranteed. Violations of IHL must be strictly investigated and prosecuted. We support the improvement of the protection system through more pragmatic measures. The SG has proposed measures to protect humanitarian and UN personnel. We hope the Secretariat will strengthen communication with the countries concerned to promote effective implementation. Missions and TCCs should, in light of the situation on the ground, provide targeted training for peacekeepers and enhance their situation awareness, emergency response, and rescue capabilities. Missions should accurately study and assess changing risks, improve contingency plans in a timely manner, and minimize casualties among peacekeepers through preventive actions. We support the harmonization of protection standards with more strict requirements. Humanitarian and UN personnel work for a noble cause by bringing peace and hope to conflict areas. Their safety should be prioritized without hierarchy, and there must be no differentiation in their protection. Double standards and the selective application on this question will only squeeze out the space for humanitarian work and condone more violations of the law, and therefore should be completely rejected. President, last September, China, together with the ICRC, France, and others, jointly launched the Global Initiative on IHL, with the aim of promoting the reaffirmation by the international community of its firm commitment to IHL, gathering the greatest possible synergy in upholding the IHL, and promoting the realization of lasting peace. We welcome more countries to join this initiative. China stands ready to work with all parties to continue to make unremitting efforts to protect the safety of humanitarian and UN personnel. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
President, and congratulations to you and to France for assuming the presidency, and our appreciation and thanks to Denmark for their presidency. I'd like to start by thanking USG Michaud, ASG Masuya, and Executive Director Lee for their insightful briefings. We welcome this session on implementing UNSCR 2730. I think it's critical that this Council maintains momentum on the safety, security, and well-being of aid workers, and I pay tribute to those on the front line and extend again my condolences to the families and friends of those who have lost their lives. In the first 3 months of 2025, the Aid Worker Security Database has already recorded 64 deaths, 36 injuries, and 8 kidnappings. The majority were local or national aid workers. The most dangerous place to deliver humanitarian assistance is Gaza, with over 400 aid workers reportedly killed since the beginning of the conflict. And that is followed by Sudan and South Sudan. We're also concerned about the aid workers detained by the Houthis in Yemen and call for their release. And we stress the need for the safety of aid workers in Myanmar, who are bringing essential responses for the victims of the devastating earthquake. At the 1-year anniversary of the attack on a World Central Kitchen convoy in Gaza, which killed 7 aid workers, including 3 British citizens. We continue to call for the conclusion of the Military Advocate General's consideration of the incident, including determining whether criminal proceedings should be initiated. Tragically, just last week, the Palestine Red Crescent Society reported that 8 of its medics were killed in Gaza, alongside first responders and a UN aid worker. We call for a thorough and swift investigation with meaningful accountability for those responsible. PRCS medic Assad al-Nassasra is still missing, and we call on Israel to support the search for him. 3 actions are essential. First, all parties to a conflict must comply with international humanitarian law. This includes compliance with obligations relating to the passage of humanitarian supplies, equipment, and personnel, and respecting and protecting aid workers. States must investigate attacks on aid workers and hold perpetrators to account. Effective, trusted deconfliction mechanisms must be set up and used. Second, we must strengthen international commitments to protect aid workers. The UK is proud to be part of the Australian-led ministers' group to develop a political declaration to galvanise collective action to protect aid workers, and we encourage others to join and to demonstrate unity to drive action beyond the Council that enhances protection for aid workers. Third, we must do all we can to support humanitarian organisations, including local organisations, to work safely. Actors who play a fundamental role in aid worker safety face operational risks due to inadequate funding. The UK supports organisations such as the Aid Worker Security Database and INSO, who play a central role in aid worker security. We urge others to consider supporting fundamental enabler organisations. In conclusion, President, the UK remains steadfast in our commitment to allowing aid workers to do their job in safety and to preventing violence against aid workers from becoming the new normal. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by extending our warm congratulations to France for assuming the presidency of the Council, and our sincere appreciation to Denmark for its successful leadership during its presidency. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Assistant Secretary General Choi Sim-suya, Under Secretary General Michaud, and Mr. Nick Lee for their informative and insightful briefing. And I warmly welcome Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the meeting. While the Security Council adopted Resolution 2730, initiated by Switzerland last May, and more than 100 member states renewed their commitment in November, last year was the deadliest on record for humanitarian workers. Even more concerning is the fact that it spans multiple regions from Gaza to the DRC, Sudan, Yemen, Haiti, and Myanmar. The gravity of this issue cannot be overstated, as each attack is not only a tragic loss of life, but also a significant disruption to life-saving assistance for civilians in urgent need. Against this dire backdrop, allow me to make the following points. First, we call on the parties to armed conflicts and all member states to honor the obligation to protect humanitarian personnel under international humanitarian law. Attacks against humanitarian workers have reached record levels year after year. Such an alarming trend has continued into this year, with 108 humanitarian personnel killed, kidnapped, or injured in the first 3 months alone. Aid workers, both international and local, must be protected under the Fourth Geneva Convention. In particular, we emphasize the inviolability of UN personnel and facilities under the UN Convention on the Safety of UN and Associated Personnel. We urge all states that have not yet ratified this convention to do so without delay and fully comply with it. Second, we urge all member states to fully cooperate with the UN and humanitarian entities to effectively mitigate risks to aid workers. In particular, it is crucial to ensure that humanitarian personnel have timely and reliable access to information and resources needed to anticipate and respond to threats, including through coordinated channels such as deconfliction mechanism. Effective implementation of a deconfliction mechanism is more critical than ever, as over 400 humanitarian personnel, including UNRWA, have reportedly lost their lives in Gaza alone since October 7, including the 15 found dead this week. We call upon all parties to maintain and implement the mechanism throughout the duration of armed conflict until humanitarian needs are fully addressed. Third, we urge all member states to actively counter mis- and disinformation targeting the UN and humanitarian organizations. Malicious actors have mounted defamation campaigns against them to disrupt their activities. In Sudan, for instance, the warring parties spread false narratives accusing the Sudan Emergency Response Room of collaborating with their enemies, thereby justifying the denial of humanitarian access and leaving millions in urgent need without assistance. If left unchecked, this worrying trend risks rendering the delivery of humanitarian aid in conflict zones untenable. We therefore call upon all states to ensure public access to accurate and reliable information, rigorously monitor misinformation, and consider sanctioning those responsible for disseminating unverified and libelous content. Fourth, perpetrators who attack humanitarian workers must be held accountable at all costs. These attacks are severe violations of IHL and demand swift, impartial, and independent investigations. States must prosecute perpetrators, and the Council should ensure this by requesting concerned states to report the progress of their investigations in line with Resolution 2730 and the Secretary General's recommendations last November. We remain concerned that attacks against humanitarian personnel are not being properly investigated in such cases as Haiti and South Sudan. States lacking such capacity should receive technical assistance and capacity building support from the United Nations and the international community. Furthermore, when national jurisdictions fail to act, international accountability mechanisms, including the International Criminal Court, must be deployed in accordance with the principle of complementarity. In closing, Mr. President, we are always touched and impressed to recognize that humanitarian workers continue to bravely operate on the front lines of multiple crises, even under extremely dangerous circumstances. However, without stronger legal protection, accurate messaging, and renewed financial support in the wake of funding cuts, their ability to deliver life-saving aid is at grave risk. As such, the international community must act with elevated resolve to ensure aid workers are fully protected and humanitarian assistance reaches those in greatest need. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President, and allow me also to congratulate you and the entire Team France for assuming the presidency and wishing you, of course, the best of luck and assuring you Denmark's full cooperation. I would also like to start by thanking Under-Secretary General Michaud, Assistant Secretary General Surya, and Executive Director Lee for their very impactful briefings. At the outset, Denmark wishes to pay tribute to all UN humanitarian personnel globally, many of whom risk their lives and work under the most challenging circumstances to bring relief to those most in need, and this with passion and courage, as mentioned by USG Michaud. Mr. President, as have been mentioned many times this morning, 2024 was the deadliest year in record for UN and humanitarian personnel. From Haiti to DRC, Yemen, Mali, and Ukraine, violence, disinformation, and intimidation have led to the killing and injury of hundreds of UN and humanitarian workers. This is evident in Gaza, which, for 23 days now, has been under a complete blockade, with 2 million people cut off from aid, water, food, and electricity. As we've heard today, since Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th and the ensuing conflict, more than 400 humanitarian staff, including 288 UN staff, have been killed in Gaza. And as a result, the UN is now faced to scale back its presence, putting its stay and deliver strategy in jeopardy. Just last week, the Council addressed this in a private meeting on the attack on a deconflicted UN compound in Deir al-Balah, an attack which killed 1 UN staff member and severely injured 5 others. This weekend, we've learned of the further devastating killings of over a dozen first responders, including Palestinian Red Crescent Society medical workers, while being dispatched to aid wounded civilians in Rafah. After 5 days of negotiations, UN teams were finally permitted to access the area, only to find their remains, ambulances, fire truck, and a UN vehicle crushed and partially buried. These medical workers and humanitarians should have been protected in their work. Denmark calls on Israel to abide by international law and respect the rulings of the International Court of Justice. Israel is obliged to resume the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza and to ensure the basic needs of the civilian populations are met. But let me be clear. International law applies to all parties of the conflict. They must protect UN and humanitarian workers and ensure the absolute inviolability and neutrality of UN premises, including by refraining from their use for military purposes. Mr. President, in Sudan, we are also witnessing a blatant disregard for the safety of UN and humanitarian staff. Nearly 2 years into this conflict, the parties continue to harass, intimidate, and target aid personnel. This creates unacceptable barriers for humanitarian operations. We remind all parties to the conflict of their obligations to ensure that life-saving aid reaches those in need. In Yemen, aid workers are being targeted by the Houthis. There, humanitarians are subject to detentions, restrictions, and harassment. And in Ukraine, since Russia's full-scale aggression, we've seen the use of cruel double-tap strikes, deliberately targeting the rescuers arriving to assist the injured. The killings of 3 ICRC staff after shelling hit a distribution site in late 2024 underscores the grave danger for humanitarians who must not be a target. Mr. President, against this dire backdrop, allow me to make 3 recommendations. First, impunity signals tolerance. If this Council fails to hold perpetrators accountable, we send the message that these crimes are permitted. That will only deepen the violence driving these catastrophic humanitarian outcomes. Second, we must demand effective investigation for attacks on UN and humanitarian personnel. Investigations must be independent, transparent, and credible. Without consequences for violations, we run the risk that they will simply continue unabated. Third, states must ensure UN and humanitarian personnel are protected under national law. Counterterrorism legislation must contain explicit exemptions for humanitarian actors. Their work must never be criminalized. Mr. President, in closing, we recall that attacks on UN and humanitarian personnel may amount to war crimes. We must insist on the implementation of this Council resolutions, including Resolution 2730. The protection of UN and humanitarian personnel is an inseparable precondition for the protection of civilians in conflict. We must use all tools available to us and seek accountability whenever violations occur. History would judge us not by our words, but by our deeds. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to join colleagues in thanking Denmark for the skillful and effective guidance of the Council in March. And we congratulate you, Mr. President, for assuming the presidency of the Council in April. You can count on our cooperation. Mr. President, we would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Ms. Suya, Under Secretary General Michaud, and Executive Director Mr. Lee for their invaluable input. We heard them, and we will be following up on their recommendations and their asks. I also want to welcome the representative of Switzerland in the chamber. Last year was the deadliest year ever for humanitarian workers, the deadliest year for women and men who choose to help others survive the hardest periods of their lives, the ones who run towards the danger when the rest is escaping, the ones who put their lives in harm's way, the ones who choose to provide hope. For battered civilians, they remain the only face of humanity left. Humanitarian workers are left to pick up the pieces when political solutions evade us. Assistant Secretary Masuya rightly pointed out that there is no lack of legal protection for humanitarian workers, but there is lack of political will. Absence of proper reaction to violations in one conflict leads to dangerous trends in others. Or to quote the president of the ICRC, Egger Spoilerich, from this chamber last September, quote, "One conflict informs the other. Boundaries are pushed into the zone of the acceptable, and more human suffering follows." End of quote. Ms. Misuya asked us what the Council is going to do given the unprecedented number of humanitarian workers being killed. So let me try to outline the answers from Slovenia. First, our collective commitment to peace and security must be guided by a renewed respect for and implementation of international law, not by a group of countries, not by a majority of the countries, but by all of us 15, and by all of us 193. Slovenia joined the global initiative on international humanitarian law launched by ICRC to reverse the erosion of respect for the international humanitarian law. As we have done time and again, we underline the respect for the protected status of humanitarian workers, facilities, and operations under international law. Intentionally directing attacks against personnel involved in a humanitarian assistance mission is a war crime and must be prosecuted accordingly. Second, humanitarian workers need to be protected. They should not be terrified to work. In 2 weeks since the resumption of hostilities in Gaza, the number of attacks on humanitarian workers has been staggering. A UN guest house, an ICRC, MSF, FAO guest houses, Nasser Hospital, all under protection, all under fire. Palestine Red Crescent Society emergency team, UNOPS and UNRWA workers killed. Slovenia condemns all attacks on all humanitarian, medical, and UN personnel, as well as on all journalists and media workers. And lastly, as stressed by the briefers, we cannot emphasize enough the need to end impunity and ensure accountability for killings of humanitarian workers. Each of these deaths demands comprehensive investigation, transparent, impartial inquiries that lead to changes in policy, to accountability for perpetrators, and to guarantees of non-repetition. The results of investigations should be shared with the Council. Mr. President, let me end this statement by welcoming the recommendations put forward by the Secretary General in his latest report on the UN Security Council Resolution 2730 and call on all Member States to support them. We thank France for organizing this briefing and suggest the Council addresses aspects of protection of humanitarian workers in country-specific settings following attacks on them more regularly. Thank you.